Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
In a moment, we are going to dive into an interview with Bridget, who identifies as an ENFJ personality type. A few things to keep in mind before we get started. First, we may use some shorthand and technical language in this interview. So if you want to download a handy guide that will help you visually follow along, visit personalityhacker.com and find that PDF directly below this episode. Second, Bridget has been through our profiler training program. She knows herself and she knows personality type very well. So with this in mind, we want to encourage you to look past any stereotypes that you might have for the ENFJ personality. We want to get to the heart of what it's like to live as an ENFJ today, talking to Bridget. If you're brand new to type, E stands for extrovert, N stands for intuitive, F stands for feeler, J stands for judger. These four letters are called dichotomies, and they're what most people know about personality type. But the true power of the system comes from understanding personality on a much deeper level. These are called cognitive functions. In this interview, we'll dive into these deeper waters. To get an overview of the ENFJ cognitive functions, search our podcast titled ENFJ Personality Type Advice. The cognitive functions can be a bit technical, so I recommend downloading our handy ENFJ guide directly below this episode. Visit personalityhacker.com to download that PDF. This week, we have a special guest on the show, Bridgette Boswell. Bridget, welcome to Personality Hacker.
Hi, thanks.
So we asked Bridget to come on here because, Bridget, you're an ENFJ in the Myers-Briggs system, and you also have gone through our profiler training event. So you're not just an ENFJ, but you understand type, you talk type, you understand cognitive functions. And we want to talk to you today about what it's really like to be an ENFJ. Like, the tangible stuff, not the abstract information you might find on the internet, but what's it like in your growth journey and being who you are. But before we do that, what do we need to know about Bridget before we start this conversation?
Well, I'm a 32-year-old in Reno, Nevada, and I was recently widowed. So I think that is definitely affecting my lifestyle a lot right now. And I think you'll see that and you'll hear that when we're talking. Other than that, I'm just I help my family run our two businesses. Sorry if you hear them in the background walking around. And a glorified bookkeeper. And yeah, I think that pretty well sums me up.
So 32 is very young to be widowed. I'm assuming that that's that you're probably still dealing with that. And that's a big part of your experience right now.
Absolutely. It's part of how I came to know you guys. And it's part of what's pushed me to develop different parts of myself. I've learned about different parts of myself, and grief in and of itself is an entire adventure. So I'm on that as well. But yeah, definitely.
So right now, a lot of times when you talk to people and hear their real, their story, like their full story, we realize that people have a tendency to be attracted to our podcast because they're in a time period of transition. And it sounds like that was something that happened for you too, is that you got introduced to us because you were going through a transition. Can you tell us a little bit about what that transition looked like for you and where you're at in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the man who passed away is why I found you guys. He was an INTP, and we had just started dating, and he mentioned how much he was into Myers-Briggs. And I had heard of Myers-Briggs as a psych major in school, but briefly, right? They give you this little paragraph excerpt in a giant textbook. And so I had heard of it in theory, but I'd never really looked into it. Well, he was super into it and I was really crushing on him. So I dug into it to get to know him, better on that level, at least. And I found that I thought it was fascinating. And then as our relationship developed, I stumbled upon you guys by accident. Just kind of fell in love with the cognitive functions and the way that you guys look at things. Then shortly after he passed away, you guys had done one of your little things letting people know that they can apply for the personality profiler training. And that's how I got into that and kind of delved into this next level, which I'm absolutely loving. And I think it's caused me to open up parts of me that I didn't even realize I was like, I didn't know that's what I was going to get from this experience. I wasn't seeking that. I just was very interested and curious and excited to learn. So
What were some of those things that it ended up opening up for you?
I think, particularly in my grief journey, it taught me as an ENFJ, I think, we're told that we live in the world of feelings. I don't know that I realized how much I live in the world of other people's feelings and how detached from my own feelings I am. And so during the live event, you guys did like a bunch of embodiment exercises. And then it was actually the introverted feeling exercise that it like broke down a veil, a wall for me that I didn't know was there. And I all of a sudden felt my feelings about the loss of my husband. And I don't know if you guys remember, but I had to like leave the room.
Yeah, I do
because
remember
I
that.
was so overwhelmed with my feelings that I just don't normally, like, they're there and they'll bubble up and they'll push over and I'll become aware of them that way. But man, it was like jumping headfirst into this really deep well and just being submerged in it. And it was intense. It was very informative. And I've since been trying to tap that more intentionally. That was huge.
Man, if you're okay with it, Bridget, I would love to go down the road of talking about how you have figured out ways to process your emotions and experiences, being somebody who leads, like you mentioned, with extroverted feeling or harmony that's so tapped into everybody else's. Would you be willing to go down that road a little bit?
Yeah.
So at that point, it sounds like you had an experience that allowed you to tap into what was going on for you. But, I mean, did it lead you down a road? Were you able to now, you mentioned that grief is its own adventure. What are some of the tools you're using, or what are some of the ways that you're experiencing, processing your own grief and your own emotional experience when you do have that instinct to divert emotional attention to others?
So I will say that as an ENFJ, it is really, really hard. I don't, that's really not in my repertoire. What's really helped me is the people around me. I'm seeing a really awesome human being who is an ISFP, and he's very, very adept with his introverted feeling. And I think he frequently, honestly, is kind of like he just asks me, how are you feeling? And so it's a reminder to ask myself, how am I feeling? Which might sound weird, but that's not something I tap very often naturally. So having people around you that encourage you to check in with yourself, that's one huge thing for me. I also learned in the live event, I think I made the connection that it was the music, like you guys used music for that exercise. And I realized that my violin, like I play the violin, that is in a weird sense, it's a way for me to kind of almost like harmonize with my insides. So when I'm playing it just like freely, just playing whatever, not playing from a sheet of music, that allows me to kind of touch it. And so that helped me to realize that. So when I'm really feeling like I need to get into my sadness and I'm struggling to get there, or like I need to have a day where I'm mourning, my husband or something like that, I'll use that as a tool to access that part of me. I think other than that, it's just trying to have grace for myself the same way that I would have grace for other people, in realizing that this is something I'm not very adept at. Kind of almost giving myself a hug, right? And being like, hey, you kind of sucked at that today. You weren't your best self, but it's okay. And,
Is there any pride that you have around, I mean, if somebody's in a relationship with a ENFJ or an ESFJ, somebody that leads with harmony or extroverted feeling, and they heard you say, yeah, I don't, emotions, that's like tough for me. They would be like, come on, really? That's all the world you live in. Like we experience harmony drivers or dominance as very emotional often, or very much okay living in the world of emotion. And you probably also self-identify that way. Like, I'm good at emotions. And then there might be this little bit of like a pride hit of having to go, oh, I don't really know how I feel. And is that like something that was hard for you to like recognize or admit, or was that easy?
It was so painful. It was like I had to re-understand who I was in the universe, because my whole life I thought I understood emotions so well. And it was I don't even know, a reckoning, right? With
Wow.
realizing that I understand what other people's emotions look like. And I live in that world really well. And I am impacted by other people's emotions personally, regularly, but I don't notice that because I'm so out of touch with my feelings. So I've been spending time trying to kind of pull that apart, because it is tough to pull that apart, but it is different, and it's not what I thought. And it was definitely a pride for sure.
I've noticed that because, of course, the other side of the polarity of extroverted feeling or harmony is introverted thinking or accuracy. And I've noticed that a lot of FJs, when they think of themselves as being adept emotionally, the emotional intelligence is almost always relational. But when they go inside, when you seek your own inner counsel, it's not going to be from an emotional place. It's actually somewhat from a more cold, logical place. And so a lot of FJs kind of identify with that, almost like they're warm on the outside, but sort of cold and steely on the inside.
Yeah, I would say it was really fascinating going through the depression after my husband passed away because of that, right? Like, I came across people who were like, are you not, like, do you have no feelings? Are you a robot? And I was like, no, I'm just like, I don't even know how to process this. And my go-to is rationalization, right? To rationalize my own feelings, not feel them, to rationalize them. So I will say that Enneagram also, I think, is really helping me to pull that apart, because that's something else that I think I do as a 6, which is a different topic. But absolutely, it is, you're right. It's like I go into, when I try to touch my feelings, I'm not really touching them. I'm rationalizing them and making sense of them as much as possible, which is interesting. It gives me language around emotion that's helpful when you're trying to talk about it. But when you're trying to like dig deep inside yourself, it's not always so helpful to feel, like, for feeling.
Well, and I would imagine that in those kinds of situations, I mean, people who have extroverted feeling or harmony, they're so tapped into how other people are feeling that it's almost like it's your husband that died, but you're caretaking everyone around you and trying to keep morale up and trying to keep things in a more positive way instinctively. And I bet that probably threw people off too. Like, no, you're allowed to be in your own grief. And you're like, no, I've still got to be in a caretaking for everyone else, while you said rationalizing your own emotional experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing, I listen to a number of other podcasts around surrounding grief with that adventure and things that I'm, trying to grow in with that too, and healing and so forth and so on. And one of the things that they say is there's this myth in our society and in our culture about being strong for everyone. And I think as an FE, I really have clung to that in my life, like in my life story. And so that was absolutely what was expressed, was like, anytime somebody else would have a feeling, mine got shut off instantly, not consciously, but they got shut off. And my focus went to taking care of that person and being strong for them and, letting them have their moment, which makes no sense, but it's just kind of how it played out.
There are moments in our life where life throws us something where our authentic wiring really comes into sharp relief. We would predict a different way or different behavior set from ourselves when we experience these like really impactful, evocative moments. And you just mentioned one of those, which is, like sort of your relationship to yourself was that you lived very easily in the realm of emotions, but then this situation helped you understand, well, it's actually other people's emotions. And I've got to keep my finger on the pulse of that, because if not, then I won't actually feel my own. Was there anything else that came up for you in this time period where you behaved differently than you would have predicted?
Oh gosh, yes. Countless ways in some sense. And I think ways that I haven't dug into inside myself enough to be mindful of it. So I think something that's coming up for me with you saying that is that if it wasn't for Personality Hacker and that live event, I don't know that I would have been mindful of that. I might have registered that my behavior seemed odd or that it didn't feel right for what was going on or the circumstances around me. I'm not sure I would have had that epiphany if I didn't have this language to help me kind of separate that out, right? It's a very fine line. Even with the language, it's a fine line, and it's tough to pull that apart. That's coming up for me big time, is like, I don't know that I think it happens all the time. And I think it is happening all the time, but without this language, I would never notice it.
You as an ENFJ use introverted intuition, which is that perspectives process, as your auxiliary co-pilot cognitive function. That's how you perceive the world. Mm-hmm. I see ENFJs a lot because that harmony process you drive with, that extroverted feeling, and quite frankly, that 10-year-old or tertiary process of extroverted sensing or sensation, You're very extroverted as an ENFJ, and you're going around the world, tapped into other people's emotions, other people's experiences. And I think ENFJs, they can easily get caught up in just the busyness of life and I don't want to say like non-intuitive things are mundane, but to an intuitive that needs intuitive focus and activation, it can feel mundane and it can kind of rob you of your soul. And I think I see a lot of ENFJs going around the world. They're active, they're engaged, but in a way they're intuitive zombies. And there's this part of you that has a deep intuitive part that doesn't always get permission, whether it's from society or the context you put yourself in, to express itself. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the journey to intuition. Is it something that's always been with you? Did you discover it through your life? Did you discover it recently? Like, what's your relationship to that part of you? And how is it showing up for you now?
Absolutely. So I think you said a lot of really important things that as a young ENFJ, I wish I could have heard because we don't realize, right? We're just living in RFE and we're just running around taking care of all these things that are presenting themselves on a moment to moment basis. And it's like you jump in to your SE and you just go and you're just acting and you're living in that external world. And it took me many years to start to explore my internal world. And I think NI showed up for me until I was in my late 20s. It showed up as just like a very kind of like, I think socially people describe intuition, right? Like just like you had a gut feeling about something, or it was very not mindful, right? I was not conscious of it. As I got older, I started to be able to tap it a little differently. Like I started to be able to spend time by myself and realize that it was important to spend time by myself to deeply think about things. I think college also helped because I met people who thought about things deeply. One of my best friends, she's an INTJ. She's always thought deeply about things, and we've always had beautiful conversations. I didn't realize that's what we were doing, but beautiful NI conversations. And then my husband, I would say, dramatically increased my tendency to go inside and to evaluate things differently and to not lean so heavily on that FE, or not even lean on it, but just to live in it so heavily, right? To not check it, to not pull out of it and question the presumptions I had made inside of it, or to like really pull those things apart. Cause I can, I mean, I have that ability, but it takes time and it takes a concerted effort to be alone.
Well, and I think what a challenge that ENFJs experience, and I would say that this is probably doubly, if not triply true for ENFJ women, is that reactionary element of jumping to get people's needs met so quickly is usually rewarded by society around you. Whereas the slowing down, the getting into more of an intuitive space, the taking the time to unwrap everything that's going on and then coming up with these intuitive ideas, I'm suspecting that that's not that rewarded. And so your growth path is one that you're not going to get a lot of cheerleading for with the rest of the world. And the one-sidedness is going to get a lot of cheerleading.
That's so beautifully clean sliced, Antonia. I think, and not unlike what you do, my husband did that for me. I think he was the first time in my life I had somebody who loved me enough to not cheerlead me for just jumping to their needs, right? He was the first person in my life that said, hey, what are you doing? Like, do you know what you're doing right now? And I would just be like, what? And he would call me out on it, and he would call me out on a lot of FE things. And sometimes those were really painful. And sometimes I didn't honestly show up so beautifully in those moments. But over time, I learned to really, really thank him for that. Because I don't think most of my ENFJ girlfriends are like, they are so in their FE because, as you're saying, that's what they're like rewarded for, right? As mothers, as people in society, they're constantly being told that they have to be on 24/7 and meeting everybody's needs. And when we don't meet people's needs, that's when we get checked, usually, right? Like, hey, you didn't do this thing you always do, and I'm noticing and I'm upset with you for it. That's kind of how it tends to show up, versus this really beautiful relationship I had with my husband where he was like, hey, I don't need you to do that for me. I need you to think about this. And I was like, oh, okay.
I've noticed that these relationships, when somebody is in a relationship where the other person has their 3-year-old or inferior function as their partner's dominant or driver function, that can be really tough. That can end up with a lot of butting heads, but it also really encourages each person not to be so one-sided. And I've noticed that of all the headbutting that happens, there's usually a kind of a sharpening smoothing out rough edges. You know what I mean? Like kind of going like, okay, maybe I need to see the value in the other side. I'm assuming that probably was very much a part of your relationship with your husband. But what were some of the things that you really got to tap into and understand and take with you about introverted thinking or accuracy as a 3-year-old in that relationship with him?
One of the things I think that comes up first for me is I used to think before meeting him and seeing TI just displayed so absolutely beautifully, I used to think I could read people's minds kind of. That sounds weird, but I was so good at seeing people's behavior, like emotional behavior, and predicting what they were going to do next, that I thought I could kind of read their minds. And I think that's an FENI thing in a young place. And he called me out on that regularly. And he taught me to use something different. And maybe it's baby TI, I'm not sure. But he taught me to question it, right? Just to question everything, but to question myself and my quick snap decisions and my snap thoughts. And I think as an ENFJ, I'm very inclined to take the social things around me that I was taught growing up, like by my mom, or the things that were modeled for me. I'm inclined to just trust in those and to exemplify them. He taught me to question them. And I think that was one of the most beautiful things that I got from him. And it's really helped me to grow my FE in really cool ways, I think.
So I have a question that may put you in that 3-year-old place. So if this is a challenging question, it's understandable, because I'm going to ask you to help make a distinction here. Because I could imagine an ENFJ listening right now, you say, you need to question yourself. I could hear an ENFJ go, wait a minute, I have self-doubt all the time. I'm constantly worrying if I'm like, okay, I'm always self-critical and self-doubting of myself. So I already do this, Bridget. It's crippling to me. I can't even move through the world. I doubt myself so much. But I think you're speaking to something a little different than self-doubt or self-criticism. You're talking about something else. And I don't know if you have that distinction with you, why that's different. So I'll just lob it out there and we can workshop it if it's in that TI for you, and it's hard for you to get that distinction. But what would you say to that?
So I'm talking about questioning the things that we don't question, that we don't doubt, that are just kind of like these softwares running in the background of our mind because they're built in, like our parents taught them to us, our society told us that that's what's right, and we never question it. It just is held as it's true. Because I know that little TI that is kind of ripping us apart on a regular basis, but I feel like those insecurities that get torn apart inside of me by TI are actually external information coming in that I'm taking personally and beating myself up with. I'm talking about the inside held beliefs that are like hardwired kind of into me almost from my upbringing that I don't normally question. Those are the ones. Those are the ones that you have to like sit down and dig into and ask yourself, why do I believe this? Do I believe this because I've seen that to be true? Or do I believe this because somebody else who I love and trust very dearly told me it's true? And that was a huge thing he taught me to do.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that this distinction it's like the difference between getting feedback from the outside world that maybe you're not competent enough or you're not capable enough, or, we get, every individual gets a ton of pieces of feedback from the outside world that has us questioning maybe not even our character, but like how we're showing up and whether or not we're good enough. And what I hear you saying is that that's not the kind of questioning a person with inferior or 3-year-old introverted thinker accuracy really benefits from. It's actually the programming on a belief level, like the things that aren't personal. The things are just assumptions about how reality works or assumptions about how the universe works. Things that you wouldn't take personally because why would you? That's just how that thing works. It's those kinds of beliefs that can use with some reevaluation, not the, am I a good enough person questions.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I think you can generalize it more for ENFJ. Sorry, that just came up for me, but something that's been really tough for me to do because I think FE just does it so quickly. Sorry for snapping, but it just does it so quickly. We want to take in information very fast and assume that we know where everyone is coming from and that all of those things are just true. And so we come to these snap decisions or snap conclusions, and they're not very thoughtful. They're just kind of like survivally, they're very useful, right? If you're in a survival situation, that's a very useful way to be. But if you're in your life, your day-to-day life with people that you love and you want to genuinely understand, which I think we all do, those are the moments where you have to then go and slow down and go inside and think, is that really what that person meant? Is this really true? Or is there another context? Is there another perspective that I should be looking through? Or I should be asking questions and saying, hey, what is your perspective? Do I have it right? And not just assume that I do.
I don't think that there's a lot of reason for somebody who's leading with extroverted feeling or harmony to question the capacities and capabilities that come from that function. I mean, you've been using it your whole life. You're probably really good at it. So then not going back and questioning whether or not you're good at that part of who you are, I think that's appropriate because you're probably really good at it. What I hear you saying is that those automatic sort of those quick judgment calls, those snap judgments on how things should be arranged, because extroverted feeling or harmony is about like, okay, what should everybody be doing right now? What should we all be sort of orchestrated to, make sure people are getting their needs met? And ENFJs will say, I have that part of me that thinks I know what's best for everyone, right? And so that's all good, right? Because that's part of what you come with, the strengths you come with. The facility in having some of those moments of questioning is that knowing what's best for everyone is predicated on better calibrated understanding of how reality works, how things are truly working. So if you already have an instinctive or natural talent for organizing and orchestrating people together and getting them all on the same page and doing what's best for everyone, then every once in a while you're going to have to reevaluate the premise, what is best for everyone, right? Like go back and make sure that piece of information is solid, because you are going to instinctively be herding cats toward it.
Yes, that's better put. Thank you for kind of clarifying, because it's hard to describe that. But yeah, it is. And we do have that talent. I do have that talent. It's very natural. What's not natural is to question it. And that is something that, like you said, calibration needs to happen. And depending on the situation that you're in, I think for me, it's come up more so in my personal relationships with people, because you have the time to question that more, right? When you're in like a bigger setting and you're herding cats in a bigger setting, it's tougher. You can do it, but then you're falling back on bigger assumptions. And that's just inside of yourself doing internal calibrations as often as you can when you're growing, whatever your path might be at that time. But I mean, in my relationships with people, I used to do a lot more of that kind of carelessly, if you will. And I've learned through my relationship with my husband and life that it deserves more thought, more mindfulness, and more calibrating than I was giving it.
We were talking earlier about the emotional processing, that there was this big aha about how not in touch with your own emotions you were. And we talked a little bit about going to introverted thinking or accuracy is like kind of almost like a more colder, detached place where you're trying to make sense of what's happening for you internally. My suspicion is that also introverted intuition or perspectives as your co-pilot or auxiliary function, my suspicion is that kind of probably also does that a little bit too by taking a meta perspective. I suspect you probably understand the principles of how a brain grieves a lot more because you've been watching yourself go through this process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's an adventure, probably is why I called it that, right? Because I'm learning in real time what that means. And it's painful because I don't know what to expect. I can't anticipate it. I can't just plan and prep like I do as an ENFJ. That's what I'm used to doing. So this has been a really tough thing because there is no answer. I can't just pull up a book. And I mean, there are books out there, but the actual experience of it in real time is something nobody can actually do for you, right? You just have to do it for yourself. I think NI mixed with people around me, helping me to use my NI to understand my feelings too, to pull that feelings information into it has been so healing for me, because I think otherwise my inclination would be to just totally rationalize it and to keep moving on and to keep pushing towards just accomplishing whatever my next goals, be it for myself or be it for everybody around me, were and kind of maybe minimizing that. But yeah, it's so cool. It's really fun. Sorry, not to be like, I love it. I think it's super neat. I think it's why I love my INTJ best girlfriend, because she is so beautiful with it. And she does it so much more like broadly than I do. In the context that she can do it in, it feels so much like more, what's the word, elegant than how I feel like I do it inside of myself. But yeah, NI is cool. It's pretty neat. And it does do that naturally within situations. It is asking those questions.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I have a quick question. What do you think you provide for your INTJ friend? If she's providing some of that NI insight, how do you think she's benefiting from your relationship?
She's never said it to me, but I think that she, especially as a thinker woman, I think she's felt miserably like she just doesn't know how to fit in or feel like she fits in, because she honestly fits in better than I do in a lot of ways, because she's masterful at like contextually organizing her universe. But she never feels like that. And I think I give her something to that extent, right? My FE gives her something that she doesn't otherwise kind of tap, if I had to guess. I don't know exactly what it is. I've never really thought about that.
What about the cognitive function you use, extroverted sensing sensation? She's going to have that as well as an INTJ. But also, this is probably something that's very powerful for you. Like maybe personally in your life, you've probably accessed this. It's probably a very active part of your personality for yourself. Would you agree to that?
Yes. Yeah. So SE, I have a love-hate relationship with SE. I love it. I want to rely on it more heavily than I should. And I see that come up for myself with like body language and stuff like that. It was absolutely vital for me as a college volleyball player. And I think that's where I developed it the most, honestly, in my life, was living in the moment, in real time, taking in external like sensory information. To be a very good volleyball player is a very fast game at the collegiate level. And so I got to see that plus NI actually do some really cool stuff, like real time pattern recognition, knowing where the ball was going to be before it was there. Some really interesting stuff that I experienced in my younger years. Now, when I'm with my ISFP boyfriend, it's really beautiful because I get to kind of see what SE looks like kind of higher up. And he's gorgeously in the moment all the time. And he brings me into the moment. And that's really powerful for me, especially in this time in my life where I can get stuck in the past, or I can get stuck trying to live in the future and not dealing with the right now all the time. So yeah, it's beautiful, especially if it's being used well. It's not so great if it's being used not well.
Well, as you've been talking about what's going on for you, at this time period in your life, I actually have heard a lot of really healthy expressions of extroverted sensing from you. And just to point it out, one thing I've noticed from a lot of particularly ESFPs, I suddenly have an explosion of ESFPs in my life in like the last year or so. And it's been really awesome, because I've been able to pattern some things about extroverted sensing or sensation I hadn't really understood before. And one thing I've heard a lot of, particularly ESFPs, but ESTPs say as well, is that they just want to experience it. Like, as opposed to learning it from someone else, they want to personally go through the experience themselves in order to take all the lessons. And I knew that about extroverted sensing, but I think I'm getting a greater understanding of exactly what that means, which is, when I go through the experience, I'm able to embody what's happening. I'm able to basically imbue it into my essence. As you were talking about introverted intuition and the patterning in grief, I heard you saying, now that I'm going through the experience, I'm actually in this space. It's not theoretical. It's not something that I'm just abstracting. It's not just this concept of grief, which might have so many stages to it, and I can understand it mentally. I'm going through it, and that means I am patterning grief itself in a whole different way. And I think that's one way that ENJs can really build a healthy relationship with that function or that part of themselves, is giving themselves an opportunity not to just be in action quickly and get things done fast, but take a moment to really feel the full experience, like be with the experience, not just the activity, but the moment, like you said. And then when you're with that experience and in that moment, now all of a sudden your introverted intuition just has all of these insights and ahas.
That's really interesting that you said that. I've never thought of it that way, but you are, yes. And it's bringing up for me, there were moments when I was playing college volleyball where I remember, and this sounds kind of weird. I'm a psych background too, so I kind of might use some of that language in this conversation, but
Please do.
I remember there were moments where it felt like time almost stood still. And the best that I've been able to come up with is that maybe I was tapping some of those, our brains are amazing, like processing machines. And there's all of these subconscious pathways that are happening all the time. And it almost felt like I could touch into those, and it felt like time slowed down because right, they're running so much quicker than our cognitive thinking processes are running. And so it was like real time. I got to feel that pattern recognition happening in real time. It was absolutely thrilling, and it didn't happen very often, but using that in like less of a sports way, using that in my life, getting into the moment and pattern recognizing in real time and experiencing the actual consequences of that in real time. I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's going to have huge impacts on the value that I get from whatever it is I'm figuring out. And hopefully for the people around me too.
I think for ENJs, oftentimes the thing that is the challenge sometimes is having a full experience like that and then giving themselves that time to process, right? Like really integrate it into the intuition.
Yeah, well, yes, because I don't think it's where we live naturally. And so we're not focused, right? That's not my focus. Like the minute I'm out of that, yeah, I can agree. The minute I'm out of most of my experiences in life, I'm out of it and I'm off way, way, way in the past or way, way, way in the future. I'm not necessarily acknowledging the power of those moments. There are moments though that are stored that are almost like in an SI fashion, not exactly, but I know like my roommate, my ESFJ roommate, she would tell me how she would post process things and how the value that she would get out of that. I thought that was so cool. So then to kind of flip that to extroverted sensing, which is not so much an internal experience, but the external experience, and then just go back and use NI to post process. Like I remembered wanting to do that after talking to her about how she uses those together. It was really cool.
Yeah. So do you find like as an ENFJ that has a lot going on, it sounds like all the time, how do you prioritize that? Do you weave it into your day, or do you use certain tools? Like, how do you make sure that you get some good quality introverted intuition time in your life?
So it is really hard for me. And I actually have less like immediate demands on me now than normal. I still have tons, like we all do, but I find times where I'm naturally forced to be alone. And then instead of doing an activity to kind of fill that time up with space, say like I drive a lot right now down to the Bay to visit my boyfriend. And so instead of just like listening to podcasts or listening to music the entire time, I'll shut everything off and I will use that as time with myself. Because it almost has to be that like choreographed, right? Like it's very hard for us to, I think for me, I can't speak for everybody, but for me to shut off all those external inputs. And sometimes I don't even want to, right? Sometimes my insides are really loud and they feel kind of scary or like there's too much and I don't want to take it on because I don't feel like I have the time or the space to do it. So I take those moments and I use them as a gift and an opportunity to spend time with myself.
Yeah, that has to be tough though. Like all the desire to keep distracted by the outside world. I mean, as a fellow extrovert, I know that that's my impulse. It's like to perpetually be distracted. Those moments with the self are, like you said, they can be really challenging.
They are, yeah, no, and they're kind of scary, I think, because that's not my go-to realm, right? So they're kind of, especially when you have things. I loved like your old podcast where you'd say there'd be dragons. Like that is how it feels a lot of the time if you have something going on that's huge. I mean, like the loss of my husband, I didn't want to go inside at all for a while because I was so scared of what I might find in there. It took me a couple months I mean, I was alone all the time, but I was constantly distracting myself. So it took me a while to consciously and effortfully want to spend time by myself. And I just did it in little moments. Like when you have something big and scary to deal with, you don't have to like dive all the way into it and go crazy. You can just be like, okay, 30 minutes today. 30 minutes, I'm going to sit by myself and I'm going to think about this thing and I'm going to let my mind go where my mind goes because I don't always have that much control over it. On this topic though, like I'm going to go there and I'm not going to just run away, right? Like I'm going to look and I'm going to see what's there. And I'm going to do that for 30 minutes today. And if 30 minutes is too much, 15 minutes today. And then like let it get bigger. And now I can do a whole 3.5 hour drive by myself if I want to, because I've been doing that, practicing. Sometimes I kind of go in and out and I'll listen to music or something kind of in the background. So I'm not the whole time, but it does grow. Like it is a skill you can build.
So what I hear you saying in that, maybe an ENFJ is listening and they're like, I want to grow my perspectives, introverted intuition, but it's scary or it seems like I don't want to slow down enough to do it. What I heard you say is, and you use grief as a tool to help, as a catalyst, I should say, but the tool you used, the catalyst was grief in your life, but the tool you used was opportunistic micro moments of just not feeling that 5, 10, 15-minute void. You let that just be with your thoughts. You're waiting in line somewhere, you're going through your day, and you have these moments come up, and you just took that as an opportunity. And then you built that over time to now where you can do a whole drive by yourself. If you had to have the radio off the whole time, you could just sit with your thoughts for the entire 3.5 hours. But that wasn't out of the gate. You had to work up to that.
Yes, absolutely.
We recently interviewed an ESTJ that said that something that she's noticed about people's opinions or their stereotypes around ESTJs is they don't understand how big an ESTJ's emotions can be, right? Like they feel very deeply. And I've noticed that with ENFJs because your type leads with, sort of this really heartfelt place. I think that people diminish the amount of thoughtfulness that it really comes from an ENFJ. And I know that you talked about sometimes it's difficult to get in that, I would call it almost like a sensory deprivation place in order to really tap into your intuition. But I think at the end of the day, ENFJs, like when they go inside, they go to a really logical, analytical, meta-perspectiving place inside. Does that resonate with you? Can you talk a little bit about some of the stereotypes around ENFJs that don't mesh with you or how thoughtful you actually are internally?
Absolutely. So it's really funny because I remember I was kind of intimidated to go to the live event because I felt like ENFJs are inherently misunderstood, which I hear all of the types saying, right? Like they love PH because personality hacker, because it's an opportunity to feel more understood, to feel like people are engaging thoughtfully. And what I wanted to say, or what I want to say, I guess, on that topic is that as an ENFJ, and maybe it's not for all of us universally, but I always want to understand people. And I'm in this place of kind of a juxtaposition between wanting to understand people deeply and emotionally and thoughtfully, and realizing that there's no such thing as fully understanding another person's experience, because without living their experience, I'll never 100% know. Right. So I am very driven by that. And if I'm in a conversation with somebody, I think I've heard that, we come across as fake or phony, or like we're just kind of catering to people to appear nice. But what I'd like to say is that instead, we are very passionately interested in getting to know somebody's true thoughts and their experience, and understanding that as best as another person can understand it. Like that's a very thoughtful thing for me. And it's not something I do in a cavalier fashion at all. Like I do that very intentionally. I don't know if that's what you were trying to get at.
Well, what I think it is like you mentioned, there's a warmth, I think, a lot of times to people who lead with extroverted feeling and harmony. Not always, but there can be that warmth that sometimes gets misinterpreted. And like you said, I've noticed that, particularly with ENFJs, I've noticed that like strong desire to get down to the principles of what makes another person's mind tick. And the warmth is instinctive, And it also allows, to some extent, for an ability to create some rapport. It allows the ability to create rapport with another person, so that person will reveal, some of those truths for them. And I've noticed that desire to really get to the bottom of that and then understand what it is at a core level, like the core principles of how people are really ticking and operating.
Yeah, I think we actually have a gift for being immensely understanding of people when we get into those places. And I can't say it again for everybody, but a lot of the ENFJs I've met, I mean, you can tell them some of the craziest things that you're feeling or you're thinking, and it's like they will take the time and the concerted effort to try to meet you there as best as another human being can. I know that I'm more mindful of it now because of learning about personality type and so forth and so on. But I'm not right. I'm not sitting there thinking, okay, talk with a soft voice and smile a lot and nod a lot. Like, yes, those are very just instinctive. But I do know that inside of me, the motivation that I can feel is that I want to provide somebody with a warm, safe environment, like mental space for them to be and to feel safe to express themselves and feel safe to share whatever it is that's bothering them or on their mind or whatever emotion it might be that might have been the reason why I was like, hey, are you okay? Like, I genuinely want to know, are you okay? And if you're not, here's a safe place for you to talk about it. And that's really like where it's coming from. So I think it hurts sometimes to hear that people think that that's like this very crafted fake thing, because it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also going all the way back to our conversation around introverted thinking or accuracy as an inferior 3-year-old function, tapping into that for somebody of your type, really tapping into that and going, maybe I need to question some of my assumptions. Maybe some of the things that I didn't realize that I outsourced how I saw reality to people around me. And now I'm thinking the thoughts that they implanted inside of me. And maybe I just need to take a minute or two to question that. You can tell when an ENFJ has done that work because they're not one-sided. They don't come across fake. They don't come across inauthentic or just trying to, sweet talk. And they also don't come across as judgmental. Like you mentioned, you will sit down and listen to somebody and hear just about anything and be able to hold space for it. I think a part of that is because you've done your own work of questioning your assumptions and realizing that maybe things aren't as cut and dry. Maybe they're not so simple. When an ENFJ or somebody leading with extroverted feeling or harmony hasn't done that work, then it's easier for them to get triggered by somebody else's truth because they're like, well, that's not how you're supposed to feel. But if you've done work around that part of yourself, you go, well, what do you mean that's not supposed, that somebody's not supposed to think that? Aren't we supposed to be reevaluating how we're thinking and hold space for people's thoughts that are a little different? And I think that some of that work is the seasoning of development that keeps an ENFJ being less one-sided. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, absolutely. What was coming up for me is I was like, when I was younger, did I really do that so well? No, probably not. And there are still moments even today where, if somebody talks about something that pulls up like a defensive response and I'm not in a really mindful place, I can still get pretty pushy, right? Like I can still not be super thoughtful or mindful in that moment. And I have to do a lot of work to pull myself out of like an extroverted feeling place and into an introverted intuition, and maybe like even a little introverted thinking help there to not do that, right? To not be that person. So it is still true. It's just not all of us. And I think it hurts because it's like, that's not our motivation. Yes, we do it. Yes, it's a weakness that we have, but we can do better. And our motivations are better. They're not what they seem, if you will.
Can I get a little practical here, Bridget?
Sure.
Let's say I say something to you that you're in an extrovert space, you're moving fast, you're going through your day, you run into me in the wild, and we have a conversation in some way, and I say something that puts you in that like immediate FE response, trigger, defense, whatever it is, it flares up. What do you do in that moment? Like, first of all, do you have any strategies of how to notice it? But let's just say if you don't, but you did notice it happenstance, how do you get yourself into more perspectives? Like, how do you move yourself away from the edge of just responsiveness like that?
Okay. So yes, I'll say two things. One, it almost never happens in the wild with strangers. I'm a lot more cautious with strangers. It happens with people that I love very much and I trust very much. So I'm not on guard with that, if that makes sense. In
Absolutely.
me, this
Yeah.
is what I've noticed in me, is it tends to come up with people that I am just free to be whatever I am. And so then those FE things come up unchecked way more. And I'll say that sometimes I don't notice it until somebody else reacts and I can tell that I've said something that offended them. That's kind of probably my most natural cueing, is like, whoa, that whatever I just said made that person uncomfortable or made them feel closed off, or it just shut down this conversation. Right. And so I'm like, okay, so that's usually the thing that makes me, and it's not always in real time. Like I can't always in real time pull back from that. I usually have to go be by myself, think about what happened and what caused that to happen. And then be like, hey, I'm really sorry. That wasn't fair of me to just make that broad statement. I don't necessarily believe that, is what I found. I had this thought. I went down and I took time and I pulled it out. And that's actually not my thought, turns out. It's just something that I had in there and it came out of my mouth. And if you're willing to, can we revise that and have a different conversation? Like it's not that smooth, unfortunately, when it happens.
What I heard you just say basically is that one of the best ways to navigate towards a more clear and complete thought inside of you and represent yourself more accurately is to be willing to take a step back, follow all of those thoughts inside, and then do conflict, like overcome the conflict, like be proactive about that. Go talk to the person. And I would imagine just the act of doing that probably also helps clarify your thoughts.
Absolutely. It is an act of humility. It's an act of being able to realize, hey, that is not necessarily how I feel. And I'm sorry that that's what, I imposed upon you in that moment. Like, hey, I'm sorry that I just was like, this conversation's not happening. This is, because that's not necessarily so. So yeah. So just, I think again, being FE Dom, you're really aware of other people's feelings. So when you say something and it hurts somebody else or it shuts them down, like it shuts down a good conversation, we're aware of that. And if you care and you're growing and you're trying to like improve, and when you're young, you care, but I think you tend to get, like I tended to get a lot more defensive and not try to work on myself. I'd just be like, oh, they're wrong. Right. As a growing adult who's learning every day, I'm much more willing to be like, hey, that wasn't fair of me. And that came from not the best place. And I'd like to talk that out more. Right. Like I'd like to have more of a conversation around that. Yeah, that's not easy for me.
No, I mean, I don't think it's easy for anybody, honestly. I mean, developing humility, that's, I mean, for 100% of humans, that's a tough thing to do.
Yeah. And
I would argue that while I do think that extroverted feeling harmony gets a bad rap, the way that you talked about earlier, what you just described is, I believe, your superpower. When somebody that has those preferences is able to get to a place where they're willing to not just shut down a conversation because this is going to lead to conflict or we had a moment of conflict, but be willing to work through the conflict and come out into the other side with some, even if it's an agree to disagree or some form of harmony on the other side, but clarifying your thoughts all the way through and getting a better understanding of how you actually think about things. I don't think anybody else does it better than your type or people who lead with extroverted feeling or harmony. And that seasoning, man, it's so needed, right? Like particularly now where everybody gets easily triggered and everything is just jumping into conflict, the negotiating through it and getting to the other side. I don't think that is as appreciated and valued and communicated as much when it's being done well. And yet I think it's absolutely critical.
I think that's really awesome. And that was something really beautiful that came out of the live event too. Catherine, she said it to me so beautifully. She said, I have an ENFJ sister and I've never understood the value of FE. And frankly, we are pretty hard on ourselves, I think. And so I don't really think very nicely on it all the time either. But she was like, it is so beautiful to see and understand and appreciate how that drive can do beautiful things in the world. And I think if we're mindful of its weaknesses, then we can use its strengths so much better. I mean, it's not easy and it's hard and I stumble way more than I am successful at it often. But yeah, it can be really, really cool. And it can lead to some incredibly deep relationships with people yeah, with people and with groups of people and things, like it can lead to some really profound, deep relationships that I can't even imagine the world without now in my personal experience.
Well, just speaking of live events, some of our profiler training classes end up being heavy towards one personality type or another. And it's just how it rolls out, right? Sometimes it's our marketing, sometimes it's, life events or world events or whatever. And we were noticing that the last probably 3 events didn't have a lot of FJs. We had a lot more TJs and FPs, and even a little bit more TPs, but not as many FJs. And then this last live event we were at, we had a lot of FJs. Again, we hadn't had one for a few cycles. And
we noticed.
You came to one of the events that we didn't have as many FJs. You were like one of the representatives, right? And and this last live event, we had like a lot of FJs for the first time in a while. And like Joel just said, we felt it. We could feel the energy in the room, like they were holding space for everything.
The support energy was incredible. I got from the stage, you're dealing with a group of energy, and you could feel the extroverted feeling harmony energy helping us on stage and in the front do our job better.
Yeah.
Like I don't even know how they were helping.
It's very esoteric, but it just was. They were just helping. It was like, I just noticed the difference so starkly.
That's so funny that you say that, because I remember, like, obviously I don't experience your like external people's experience of me. And when I hear about external people's experience of me or ENFJness, like it freaks me out, because I'm like, what? That's your interpretation? Oh, okay. But I remember behind me, oh man, I'm blanking on his name, but he sat right behind me and he was an INFP. And I'm tall, right? So I was like blocking his view. And this all happens very subconsciously. I register that I'm probably blocking his view and I just move. And he asked me, he's like, why'd you move? And I was like, well, I was in your way. And he like comes up to me after and he was like, that was FE in action. And I was like, yes, it's very just naturally we're kind of monitoring and scanning for needs of people around us and doing it. And it's like a beautiful thing, right? In that sense that it just wants to help. When it's in its best form, it just wants to help and be helpful all the time, which is great. When it's not great, it's not great, but we work on that. And yeah.
I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation on a high note of extroverted feeling or harmony. I think sometimes this mental process can be misunderstood. And I think ENFJs can sometimes be misunderstood, right? And how you're showing up to the world. And I think you're a great representative of an ENFJ who's on a growth path, Bridget. And I really appreciate the work you've put in to yourself to be able to show up to this conversation today and just share with us and maybe the person listening some of the things that have really impacted your life. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
It has been an absolute pleasure to be here and to share with you guys. And I am looking so forward to hearing these other 15 personality type interviews as well. So thank you very much.
So what do you think? You've been the 4th person in this conversation between myself, Antonia, and Bridget. You haven't had a microphone, but we do want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Share your thoughts, maybe a comment, a question, or more importantly, your story. Maybe you're an ENFJ listening right now, and you've gone through your own growth journey that you'd like to share with us and other people in the community. They can benefit from that. Or maybe you've got a question, or maybe you're struggling in your life and you'd like some calibration. You could ask a question there as well. Or maybe you have an ENFJ in your life and you'd like to make some comments or questions about that person or persons in your life and maybe how to relate to them better. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. You can also special order it through local bookstores, which is our preference. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
I always interrupt you here now.
I know.
And want to highlight the book because I think it's a fantastic resource. It's not very expensive. It's a great addition to your reference library. It walks you through the Myers-Briggs system, taking that 4-letter code like ENFJ, for example, and helping you understand how you're learning information and making decisions, how your mind is cognitively wired. So it teaches the system, the basics of it, in a workbook format, step by step. And then there's a chapter dedicated to your specific personality type. All 16 are addressed. And those also have tangible growth strategies for your personality type. It's a great place to start in your type journey. So I just want to continue to highlight this book. I think it's a fantastic resource for your home library.
Yep. So go get yourself a copy. And if you are ready to take your personal growth to the next level, we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So if that sounds interesting to you and you're ready for that, it's the right moment on the timeline of your path, head over to personalityhacker.com and under our program catalog, see if there is one that is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.